In the book of Ephesians, we started, of course, with the first 3 chapters, which are about the God of glory and the magnificent salvation he has provided for us so graciously. And then we start in the 4th chapter with, therefore, how we should walk. And we spent like a chapter and a half discussing, or Paul does, discussing how we should walk. Walk being our living, our way of life. And so that particularly, the first part of that applies to our personal attitudes and our personal character, our personal activity of the way we live. And we get to the middle of the 5th chapter, he begins to identify some relationships. I've categorized those into 4 relationships that he wants to deal with. That's not all the relationships we have in life, but he has 4 relationships he focuses upon. First is our relationship with Christ and the church, and how that seems to be one of his primary concerns. Everything and all of our relationships in life are patterned around our relationship to Christ and the church. It's the pattern or the ideal relationship. The second relationship, and we spent last Sunday talking about much of that, about the relationship of marriage. How that is to mirror our relationship with Christ and the church in all aspects. And I won't get back into that this morning, but that is a mirror. Our marriage is to mirror our Christ's relationship with the church. This morning, we're going to look at 2 more relationships. One is going to be the parent-child relationship, which is a relationship we have here in this life. And the 4th and final relationship we're going to look at this morning. And it's set in the context of their day when slavery was prevalent. It was a prevalent way of life. And he talks about how people who are in that relationship, or a master and a slave, or a master servant, how that relationship should mirror how God relates with us. And so we're going to first look at the children and parent relationship, and then the servant master or slave master relationship. I want us to, as we look at this, I think it's key for us to see that Christ or God in Christ, through the Apostle Paul's writing here, trying to get us to see that for us to function in this life as he would have us to function, everything needs to mirror the way he functions with us. And that's our goal, is we function like he functions. And in these relationships, there are people who have the leadership role and people who have the led role. I hate to say servant, because one of the things he talks about here is in the 21st verse of the 5th chapter, is we all serve or subject to each other. So we'll have the servant perspective no matter where we're in the leadership portion of the relationship or we're in the servant portion of the relationship, just as God served us, even though he is obviously in the leadership portion of our relationship, he served us. And so that's one of the focuses of this discussion, is the servant mentality or perspective, no matter where you sit in one of these relationships. You're there to serve the other person, not to draw things out of the relationship selfishly for yourself. And so we're going to look at the parent-child relationship now, as we, it's in Ephesians, the 6th chapter. One other thing, these relationships, I think, are all key to God's design for life and for the promotion of God's intent when he said for man to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. God didn't expect us just to fill the earth with people, with physical people. He expected us to fill the earth with people who look like him, because Adam and Eve were created like him. And so the husband and wife relationship, the marriage relationship, is one of the key elements of us propagating God's image in the earth, and now training children, which is we're going to see as parents' responsibility, is one of the key elements in propagating people like God in the earth, is through the training or the training of children. And so he doesn't have a long discourse here on children, but he gives us some things I think that are key. He talks about in the 6th chapter, verse 1, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. I want us to see how that's so significant and how that influences our lives is and I want to reference in this Romans, the 1st chapter and verse 30. In that discussion, Romans 1 and verse 30, when he talks about how the world has just abandoned God, and because they wouldn't have God in their mind, one of the sins that he lists in that, he talks about all the, we generally think about all these immoral things he lists there. One of the things he lists in verse 30 is disobedience to parents. And I think that's key for us to understand that that is part of God's law, is for, or God's intent is for parents to lead children in the way that it should go. And we're going to see that in this passage here in just a few moments. But not for children to throw off all leadership from previous generations. The important, and this is something we saw all through the Old Testament in the form of in the law of Moses and the elders of the city and the parents, the place of honor, respect that parents were to have. The book of Proverbs is prolific with the idea that parents should instruct children. Children should listen to their parents. In Proverbs 1, verse 8 and 9, it says, son, hear the instruction of your father and your mother. So the idea that children are not inherently born knowing, I think is significant for us. And they need instruction. And that's our role, our goal as parents. So with that, children have to learn that they have to be submissive to their parents. It's not something that I think is inherent with children, but they have to be taught that parents, they have to be submissive to their parents, and from the very beginning, because if it's not taught from the very beginning, then an attitude or a walk or a way of life will be developed that is rebellious to the authority, particularly the authority of parents, and to a life of leadership. I'm going to skip verse 2 for just a moment and talk about just what he talks about in verse, I'll go ahead and include this. Honor your father and your mother, which is first commandment of the promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. These are referenced from the Deuteronomy. The thoughts in Deuteronomy is the children of Israel being sent in the land. Honor of their parents and respect for their parents was very important as children learned that, because that was going to be one of the things that kept them in the way of serving God, was parents serving God and children learning to serve God under the parents. And just talked about this as one of the first commandments of his promise. I'm not sure that that's it's not the only one or the first commandment ever given with a promise. But I think the idea is it's a primary command. Primary means it's essential or it's of top order. And we have to consider it was essential of top order. So I think that's important for us as parents to know that this is one of our primary charges as parents, is to be instructive of our children, or train our children. And then we need to train our children to understand that they need to learn from their parents or the older ones, because it's going to be better for them. Now, how might it be better for children to learn from their parents? Just think of some practical ways. Pardon? Yeah, well, how would it be? Why is it better for children to learn from their parents and submit to their teaching of their parents? In what ways does that help children? Okay, well, if parents are treating them better, they'll learn to do that. Okay. Some other thoughts. Okay. And he's going to get down to that idea here later in the chapter. The devil is always planting bad seed out there. And he's going to talk about that. And if they don't learn the word of God from their parents, they're going to learn some of the devil's bad seed. They're going to accept them. And of course, that's always going to go in the wrong direction. And that's super important for us. It's not going to be, they're going to learn something. We've got to make sure they learn the right things. Other thoughts? Yes. Okay. Pointing out the dangers. I think none of my sons are here this morning, so I'm going to share this. One of the greatest compliments I ever got from one of my sons was, it seems like every time we were about to get in trouble, Dad always knew where we were. Now, why do you think Dad knew that? Dad had been in some of those places. We've learned from our mistakes, and we try to help our children not to make those mistakes. That's no compliment me getting in trouble, but at least trying to pass forward that information. And that's why it's important for children to respect parents, because parents have made mistakes. I don't think there's any of them that'll tell you they haven't, but they're trying to help you avoid those mistakes. Again, because our walk is to be the walk of God. And so that's really important for us. So it's other things that, other thoughts on that. Now, I think it's easy for us as parents to see when we're looking at our children, and our children are still in the formative years, I'll put it that way, that how we as parents have more experiences, and hopefully we've studied the scriptures significantly so we can convey and teach good advice to them. And so that's why it's important for children to learn to listen to their parents and respect their parents. Again, I think it goes back to the idea that there is a way of life that God would have us to walk, and that way of life is learned through instruction. And the primary function of the parents it's a primary command that has a promise they'll walk in a better way of life if they listen to their parents. Now, just one other thing, we advance in time, and some of us get older, and we are still parents, but our children are now in a reverse position. And some of us, we see that happening where parents begin to get old and get feeble, like Ernestine and myself now. And that's where I think the second verse comes in here for us is not something honoring our parents or paying attention to them stops when we get 21. It's something that is a lifelong event. And I think that's important for us to see that as we get older, what we as children now, part of honoring our parents is take care of them. And I think that's Jesus addressed this discussion in Matthew the 15th, Matthew the 15th chapter, verse 1-9, as he's talking about the Pharisees there. They wanted to say, my responsibility to my parents, I gave my temple tax, my temple gift, and let them go over there and get taken care of. I'm not responsible to take care of them anymore. But that's not honoring parents. It's all the way from the birth to the grave, I think is the idea for us there. And I just wanted to mention, any other thoughts on that? So it's a lifelong walk or way of life that we have respect for our parents, whether we are in the very formative years or whether we are in the advanced years. And that's how God's image is going to be propagated among us as parents and children. Okay. Now, that's generally from the children's perspective. In verse 4, he goes to the father's perspective. He talks about fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in a discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. Some other versions talk about do not exasperate your children. I think that's the very thought he uses in Colossians 3 and verse 21, kind of a parallel passage. And the idea I get from that is exasperate is to, through unreasonable expectations, to either drive your child away or to drive them to anger. Excuse me. So he puts it's interesting how he looks at the leadership role of parents. We've already looked at the submissive role of children to the leadership of parents. Now, looking at the leadership role, when you think about do not provoke or exasperate your children through unreasonable expectations, he's saying don't be a selfish father. Don't be a selfish mother and demand of that child what you want unreasonably without, being overbearing or demanding that unreasonable. So there's this idea that in this bringing up a child is going to take a certain amount of reasonableness on our part, a certain amount of understanding on our part, and it cannot be for our benefit. It's for the child's benefit. That's our perspective as a parent in that. So our perspective as a parent is that now we've been given this charge by God to fill the world with God's image. So in working with the child, it's our goal to help that child see God's image. So some thoughts on that. It talks about the discipline and instruction of the Lord. We do want to talk about those two ideas in a moment, but anything else before we look at those two ideas? Okay.
So you have both sides of the spectrum. This exasperation, over discipline, unreasonable discipline, can be about anger. That's serious. That's serious. People will come back around, but it's hard to understand that the Father initially seeing them through you.
Right.
Parents place for lose. And the children begin to interpret them, especially the father figure. So if you told a parent, they may think it's not that. Well, they can become angry. And then the other side of that is not lose heart. You've got anger, the other end is you can break your spirit. I'm broken. Right. And it's really, really hard to prepare that once that happens. It's hard to prepare that. Like, you want your child to be the best he can possibly be. It's God's image bearer, and use whatever potential God is able to do by grace. And so it takes a lot of wisdom, it takes a lot of prayer, a lot of evaluation, assessment of him. But that's one way he proves himself. God's father to his child. That's one way we prove ourselves. And in the time that man, he's shown himself to be a capable shepherd, not because of his life. But it takes a tremendous amount of prayer and thought and evaluation, total dedication to God, bring about the result of this is now this son, this daughter now, give it full heart, life, soul, mind, strength to do God. And it takes a tremendous amount of time to evaluation. There's both ends of that spectrum that we can cause it to be overreached or underreached.
Okay.
Break their spirit. God can repair that person, but it's.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because that seems to be, if you look at this, the verse here in Ephesians 6, verse 4 in the Colossians verse. He talks about anger here and he talks about breaking the heart there. And so that's two ways of really driving a child away from God. Is you make him angry at God because he sees in you something that he doesn't like, which you're supposed to be mirroring God. Or you defeat him to the point that he does not feel like he can do anything to be with God. Now, that's a great, and so it's going to take a lot of balance on our part. It's not something easy, but it's going to take balance on our part. The key to that balance is taking selfishness out of the equation. David.
First of all, engine builder tells you what parts to put on first, second, third, how what order they go in. Piston goes on the tank run up the end, and the end goes through the rod goes on the main tank, all that stuff. But then down at the bottom of that sheet, you'll get the torque specs or how pat each individual one. I think verse 4 is basically the torque specs or the temperature you set the oven to make it take. So this the general principle in 1, 2, 3, and 4 says this is where the limits are. This is how you're supposed to set this thing up.
Okay.
So because how hot to set the oven before you start mixing the ingredients, whatever recipes or technical manuals or whatever it is, on manuals. This is basic instructions here, and the way that we're familiar with it, just reads differently. So,
Okay. Thank you, David. You'd expect David to do an engine analysis, wouldn't you? A comparison. But I think he's right. And it puts limits. You know, we have this instruction, we have this leadership, but it puts it within a thoughtful limit for how we approach our children. And I think this is essential for us as parents. We have to be individuals who understand the end goal. We have to understand that we're helping form one in the image of God and that we don't have the answers, God does. It's not about us. It's about propagating the world with people in God's image, which in this case is our children. Very good thoughts. Anything else on that section? Those of you who have young children, and this is really critical, I think, to thinking of how you see these children as you're going forward. Now, I know that we had 3 young boys at one time, and it can be frustrating. I won't use the word exasperating, but it can be a challenge, let's put it that way, to keep your perspective right in the midst of battle. But that's important for us, to keep our perspective right about what our goal is. Again, it's not about us. It takes patience, and it really takes us as individuals pulling back on our personal wishes and our personal goals and setting those parallel with God's goals rather than just what is in the world. Okay, any other thoughts here? This discipline and instruction, I just want to make one more thought before we go on into the next section. Discipline is a word that I think our society does not want any part of. It implies the idea of restraints or a prevention for something that's going in any direction. But we understand to be productive in life, we have discipline. You go across the bridge down here at the Kentucky River, There's really a nice guardrail on both sides of that bridge. Because I don't think any of you want to fall off that 200 or 300-foot cliff on the side of that bridge into the river. That kind of disciplines all of us, even in the case we have a tire blowout. It keeps us on the bridge. And so that's a concept of discipline. It funnels or channels in a certain direction. Now, sometimes that's very much corrective. Proverbs talks about that a lot, about, it's important that we and discipline our children. And in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, talks about this idea of God disciplines us because he loves us, he chastises us. And so it's a function of love or chastisement. Discipline's goal is to keep us in a good place. Where now instruction, and these I think have to go hand in hand. Instruction is to teach us the good place, teach us where God would have us to be. But sometimes we need help funneling or channeling us in the right direction. And so doing a balanced approach to discipline and instruction is our goal as parents. And this is instruction in the Lord. It's a how to live the life, the wise life. I would recommend the book of Proverbs to all parents and children to sit down and read particularly the first 9 chapters together. The book of Proverbs, and then pick select groups of Proverbs and deal with common topics and study those together, because those are really, that is the wise man trying to instruct his sons on how to live a good life, a well-formed life. So, and I think it's kind of the pattern for us is teaching on discipline and instruction. Other thoughts here? Many of you have touched on that, but I did just want to make those comments. And do go, and I'm not going to read it in class here, but Hebrews 12, 5 through 11 talks about how God disciplines us with purpose, and it's not necessarily fun at the moment of the discipline, but it's for a purpose. Okay, anything else on children? We've got a few minutes left. We're going to talk about the slave servant or slave master relationship. Again, a relationship in which there is one who has the primary leadership role and one has the primary submission role. I've mentioned before, this is not the Bible sanctioning slavery, but rather he is instructing people who find themselves in slavery how to respond in that. And I believe if you go look at the other teaching in the New Testament, Paul even says, if one can be free, it's better to be free. And so the Bible is not sanctioning for slavery, but neither is the Bible, and I think this is important for us, is I think we're going to see, we get down in 10 through 14. Neither is the Bible trying to start a revolution of society from the perspective of changing all the activities of society. The Bible is aimed at, or God is aimed at us as individuals, about our hearts and our walks as individuals. And society will change as our hearts as individuals change, then societal relationships will change. And I think that's a complete approach of the scriptures. And I think that really comes to lie down in 10 through 17 as we look at the conflicts there. Okay, he says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With goodwill render service as to the Lord, not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive back from the Lord, either slave or free. And masters do the same thing to them and give up threatening, knowing that both your master, or both their master and yours is in heaven. There is no partiality with him. Some of the things that are important for us to see, I think, in this. The concept of some people being subject one to another is where he began this section. In the 5th chapter and verse 21, he said, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. We as individuals, as we're going to look at our relationships, we've got to be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. That's his statement. Then he examines certain significant relationships. The slave-master relationship was a significant relationship in their day and time. It was not, the other three relationships we looked at were created by God. The slave-master relationship is not created by God, it's created by mankind. Anyway, there are 5 things that he mentions in this section here that are essential from the perspective of submitting, of servants or slaves submitting to their masters. In verse 5, he talks about with fear and trembling or humility. And you say, well, how a slave's already been humbled. How can he be humble? Well, humility is respecting that you're in a position that you cannot overthrow and you're going to fulfill your duty in that position. That's a part of being humble. And so that's the idea of fearing, respecting or humility. The next thing he mentions is the idea of sincerity of your heart. It's something that you're sincere, that you're in this role or this relationship, and you're going to fulfill this relationship as if it were a relationship with God. You're sincerely going to put your effort into fulfilling that relationship. The third idea, I think, is in verse 6. We do it for honestly for what it is and not to make a show for people. We do it with honesty or fulfilling our relationship. And then verse 7, we do it with cheerfulness. We do it for the good of the person we're serving. Just like we should serve God rendered as to the Lord. And then finally, the thing that makes this work is that we have to trust that God will reward us with a reward we need and not depend upon that from the master or from the world. But we have to have a trust in God. So humility, sincerity, honesty, cheerfully or willingly, trusting God with the outcome. I think all 5 of those are important. Otherwise, we're going to become rebellious if we think we have to determine the outcome. And I think this can be applied. We don't see in our nation or in our society this slave-master relationship. And that's good, we don't see it. But we do see a employer-employee relationship. And abuses in those relationships have given rise to all sorts of problems in our society. And we need to take the same attitude toward our employer-employee relationship that they were to take toward slave-master relationship. Some thoughts here. Dempsey, you got anything to say?
I agree with it. As you pointed out, human tribe. I think that Jesus' statement about divorce, it said that from the beginning, it's not been this way. It's not what God intended. It's not what 1, 2, 5, but there was a part that was so ingrained that God graciously, where he chose, he regulated it. He regulated the divorce situation. And he regulates this. And at the same time, provides principles that I think that are labeled in most places. And that is love your neighbor yourself, serve one another. And I think it's those kind of biblical teachings eventually drove the conscience of men to say, we can't do this.
Right.
This person is just. This is not right. I believe it's the principle that we should go with this conscience.
Okay. And along that line, the children of Israel were not allowed to enslave their brethren. They were not. So that shows that God, in His purpose, and the nation of Israel was to be the mirror of God. That was their very purpose as a nation. He was a holy God. They were to be a holy nation that mirrored Him. And one of the things in that mirroring God and His law, they were not allowed to enslave each other. And so I think that's the testimony to what God's intent was. And this is indeed been contrived or created by man for man's selfish purposes. Now, the same thing can be said about some of the conflicts we have in employment, and we've seen particularly in Kentucky. In the past, we saw a great conflict between the coal mine owners and the employees and the unions. We had some very deadly conflicts in that, where they had to call out to state police and National Guard to stop some of that conflict or fighting. That's employer-employee. They were not treating each other with submission. They were not treating each other in kindness. So it ended up in a very horrible conflict. Most of you are too young to remember that, but I do remember those days, and when there were these conflicts and people being killed into mines and over this conflict. That's where society can end up if you end up with selfish employers and selfish employees, where He's saying you've got to work for each other's benefit. The reason for employment is for mutual benefit. And I think that principle is very true in our day. So that should affect our total perspective. If we're an employer or an employee, whatever I do as an employer is not just for me to take all the profits and for myself, and everything's for myself and just abuse my employees. It's for our mutual benefit, for us all to walk in a life that's before God. And that is so foreign to our society and kind of our greed of money. It's so foreign to that, the way we've developed as a society, that's one of our abuses in a society today, is that we see these relationships as, well, what am I going to get out of it? And any of you besides me remember the coal mine conflicts we had in East Kelly? I know he does. He lived there. Millie, some very difficult times for people. Okay, any other thoughts on that?
I was just thinking about Daniel, we have the entire, all of Israel carried on into captivity. In that period, the person who you deliberately celebrate is not the guy who caused the most trouble with Babylonians. While he was there, the person who you celebrate is Daniel, because in spite of that, he continued to have exemplary service to God, always doing what God wanted.
Okay, and Daniel was a perfect example there. And what did he do every day? He opened his window and prayed to God. And so he was submitting himself to be God in God's image, and he got recognized as an honest, trustworthy servant because of that. And that's what we have to be. Now, the first night, I just want to say, well, we got just a couple minutes left here. He addresses the masters, and first thing he says to them, do the same to them. Well, what he just told us, the servants or slave, be humble, sincere, honest, cheerful, and trust God. He's turned to the masters or the leaders in this relationship. You be that way, humble, sincere, honest, cheerful, and trust God. And then he says, give up threatening. knowing that both your master or their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality in him. Do not, that's almost what he said to the fathers, wasn't it? He says, don't be overbearing to the fathers. He says, don't be threatening to the masters. What's this idea of threatening? It's the idea of you seeing that a person seeing that they have power over another and threatening to crush them with that power they have. Is the idea of threatening. One finds himself in a position of power, and they're going to, if that one doesn't do what they want, they're going to crush them. We see that in our political world all the time, right? That's the abuse of power. And that's close. I'm going to get to politics this morning, but that is a realm that is ripe for the abuse of power, is our political realm. And sometimes employers, or particularly the master relationship, it was a realm that was ripe for the abuse of power because there were very few consequences, earthly consequences, that came to a master for abusing his power over his slaves. Slaves were seen as property, and there were very few consequences. What Paul is doing here, he's turning that around, says, oh, wait a minute, you think about this in the life context, you still have a master who is seeing everything you do. Now, do you want God to abuse his power with you? I would say not. I would certainly hope not. So, to me, the point he's making here, our relationship with those that we have leadership role over, whether it be the slave masters they talk about here, where it be employer, employee, or if we were the mayor of the town. In our leadership role, we must see our relationship is one based upon God and not fleshly power. That, to me, that's quite essential in all of our relationship, whether it be marriage, or it be our child relationship, or employee relationship, whether it be a political relationship. Our relationship has to be based upon our relationship with God, how he relates to us and we relate to him, and not on the fleshly power. Because if it's based on the fleshly power, it's going to get selfish real quick. And that's the key. You know, we cease to be subject to one another when based on fleshly things. That's kind of my thoughts on these things. Dempsey?
The next verse, as a servant in that relationship, it would be very hard, extremely hard, depending on the master. Master is not good, hard to do, nonetheless, it's the right thing to do, obviously. Some of those masters working further as a result. Verse 10, be strong in the Lord. Be strong in the Lord. Here's one. Put on the armor of God, full armor, which will stand against the schemes of the devil.
I'm glad Dempsey went ahead and brought that verse up, because that's where we'll be again next Sunday. I want us to take that, and he's going to look at all. This is a summary of all these relationships. This is a charge here of how we function. All that. He says, if you're going to be successful in these relationships, be strong in the Lord. Be strong in the Lord. Where it's a marriage, a parent, in the church, or in your employment, be strong in the Lord. That's going to give you true success in the relationship. Thank you.